Before we begin this episode, we would like to send out a special thanks to our new sponsor, Postmates, for supporting The Trail Went Cold. As usual, your stomach and the rest of your life are at war. You need to eat, but you can't stop what you're doing to deal with it, and the only fast things that deliver are not what you want. For a limited time, Postmates is giving you $100 of free delivery credit for your first 7 days. To start your free deliveries, download the Postmates app and use the promo code COLD. Once again, download the Postmates app and the promo code is COLD. Thank you and enjoy the show. March 15th, 1989. Frederick, Maryland. 17-year-old Tracey Kirkpatrick spends the evening working alone at a shopping center clothing store. Nearly 2 hours after the store was supposed to have been closed, a security guard discovers Tracey's body in the storage room, and she has been stabbed 7 times. 3 months later, a man calling himself Don phones a national confession hotline and claims that he is responsible for Tracey's murder. Police track down a promising suspect and are unable to link him to the crime, but as the years go on, rumors start to circulate about another suspect being the killer, and that a cover-up was orchestrated to protect him. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello, my name is Don, and I'm calling from Frederick, Maryland. I know this is going to sound surprising, but 3 months ago, I stabbed a girl to death. And you might think that in making this tape, I'm setting myself up to be caught, but there are a lot of guys named Don in Frederick. The girl I killed was working in a ladies' sportswear store. I often came by and talked to her when she was working alone. And one night when she was in the storeroom and we were talking, our conversation turned into an argument. And so I took out a knife that I have with me at all times and I killed her. And a few days later I realized that I had created a lot of sadness. And I thought about turning myself into the police. But whatever they do to me, that won't bring Tracey back. So I've decided that I better keep free because we have the death penalty in Maryland. Thanks for listening. I'm sorry about what I did, but nothing can change it. Bye.
Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and that sound clip you just heard is the recording of a phone call in which a suspect seemingly confessed to the unsolved crime which will be the subject of today's episode, the 1989 murder of Tracey Kirkpatrick. This is the horrific story of a well-liked 17-year-old high school senior who was brutally stabbed to death during her shift at her place of employment. The case would eventually be featured on Unsolved Mysteries, which played the recording of that confession, and it became one of the more vivid moments ever featured on the show. The source of that recording was a man calling himself Don, who called a national confession hotline months after Tracey's murder and took responsibility for the crime. Police did track down an individual who had a major obsession with the case and ultimately ruled him out as a suspect, but it's not entirely clear if he was the same person who made the phone call and confessed. If the caller wasn't the killer, is it possible they were trying to lead the investigation towards the real perpetrator? This is a pretty complicated case because it seems like a lot of people in the community believe they have a pretty good idea about who the killer is, and if you do any searching online, you'll find a lot of rumors and hearsay. While this person is connected to the case, he has never been publicly named as a suspect, so we'll have to tread carefully. But since we've nearly reached the 30th anniversary of this murder, I thought it would be an ideal time to do an episode about it, as some people believe this should have been solved a long time ago. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the unsolved murder of Tracey Kirkpatrick. Our story begins in Maryland in 1989. Our central figure is 17-year-old Tracey Lynn Kirkpatrick, who lives in the small community of Point of Rocks with her parents Billy and Diane Kirkpatrick, and has 2 sisters and a brother. Tracey is a senior at Brunswick High School, who also happens to be an honor student and is very passionate about poetry. In fact, a poem she wrote had recently been published in the New American Poetry Anthology. Tracey is hoping to attend business college in the fall to study accounting, before eventually working her way through law school. She holds down 2 part-time jobs at the West Ridge Square shopping center in the town of Frederick, which is about a 20-minute drive from Point of Rocks. One of the jobs is at a shoe store, while the other is at an adjacent clothing store called Aileen Lady Sportswear, where she works as a sales clerk. Even though Tracey's parents told her it was not necessary for her to work, she insisted on taking these jobs to help pay her own way through college and avoid burdening her family. On the evening of March 15th, Tracey was assigned to work the closing shift at Aileen Lady Sportswear, and it would mark the first time she closed the store alone. That night, Diane visited Tracey at the store in order to bring her food, and at around 8 p.m., the store manager checked up on her. The last time anyone recalled seeing Tracey alive was at around 8:45, 15 minutes before closing time. She was scheduled to come straight home immediately after her shift ended, but as 11 o'clock rolled around, Tracey had still not shown up. Her parents became concerned, as Tracey had told them that if she did not return by that time, they should assume something was wrong and come get her. So Billy and Diane drove to the shopping center, but when they arrived, they were horrified to discover that the police were there. When Diane approached them, she immediately cried out, quote, "Tell me nothing happened. Tell me there's nothing wrong with her." But unfortunately, the police told her that Tracey's body had been discovered inside her store's back storage room. She had been stabbed to death a total of 7 times in both her back and her chest. This news caused Diane to go into shock, and she had to be treated at the hospital. The discovery had been made by the shopping center's security guard. He claimed that he had passed by the store at around 9 o'clock and noticed the lights were still on, but just assumed Tracey was inside totaling the receipts and finishing her shift. However, the guard would pass by the store again at around 10:45 and was surprised to see that the lights were still on. Since the front door was unlocked, the guard went inside and called out for Tracey, but received no response. He then proceeded to walk into the storage room and found Tracey's body before he contacted the police. There were no signs of forced entry or signs of a struggle, which seemed to indicate that the killer might have been someone Tracey knew. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found, but there was a blood smear on the store's rear door, as well as a partial print, and blood drops were discovered in a rear hallway which led to the loading dock. At the outset, police were left completely baffled by the crime, as there didn't seem to be any apparent motive. Tracey was not sexually assaulted, and nothing had been robbed from the store. The cash register, which recorded its last transaction at around 8 p.m., still had $60 in it, and there was even money lying on the counter, which Tracey had presumably been counting right before she was killed. But Tracey's car keys, store keys, and purse, which contained very little money, were missing. At the approximate time the shopping center closed, a man had been waiting in the front parking lot for his girlfriend, but told police he did not see or hear anything unusual. Since Tracey was an incredibly well-liked person and didn't have any known enemies, the crime had a devastating impact on her family and the community, and a $5,000 reward would be offered for information leading to an arrest. When she was buried, Tracey's tombstone would be inscribed with one of her favorite poems, Remember, written by the famous Victorian poet, Christina Rossetti. 3 months after the murder, there would be a surprising development when the Frederick Police Department were contacted by an attorney who represented a nationwide television confession hotline in Las Vegas. The hotline was set up to charge callers to record confessions of their deepest secrets for strangers who would call and pay to listen to them. But they were taken aback when they received a call from a man who said he was from Frederick, Maryland, and that his name was Don. He then proceeded to make a confession to stabbing a girl to death 3 months earlier. You already heard the actual recording of this call at the outset of this episode, but here's a quick summary. Don claimed the victim was working in a ladies' sportswear store and that he often came by and talked to her when she was working alone. He claimed they were talking in the storeroom one night until their conversation escalated into an argument. Don reacted by pulling out a knife which he said he always carried with him and proceeded to stab her to death. Don then said, quote, I realized I had created a lot of sadness and I thought about turning myself in to the police, but whatever they do to me, that won't bring Tracey back. So I've decided that I better keep free because we have the death penalty in Maryland. End quote. While Don expressed remorse for the crime, it seemed like he had no plans to turn himself in. Investigators became convinced that the confession sounded genuine and that Don really was Tracey's killer. They were able to trace the call to a payphone outside a supermarket in the town of Walkersville, located only 8 miles outside of Frederick. In response, the police decided to publish a letter in the local newspaper, the Frederick News Post, on October 10th, urging him to come forward and assuring him that they were available if he needed someone to talk to. The Frederick County State's attorney also publicly announced that the state would not seek the death penalty if an arrest was made. While the police never received any response from Don, they were contacted 2 months later by Martha Woodworth, a self-proclaimed psychic from Massachusetts. Woodworth claimed she had repeatedly been contacted by a man calling himself Sean, who seemed to have an obsession with the Tracey Kirkpatrick case and catching the person who killed her. When Woodworth asked for more information about the case, Sean sent her an envelope filled with newspaper clippings. However, she said that Sean's handwriting gave her a bad feeling and made her believe that he was more involved in the crime than he let on. When Woodworth contacted the police, they played her a recording of Don's confession. She said that she recognized his voice and was convinced that Don and Sean were one and the same. The envelope Sean sent to Woodworth also happened to have a return address in Walkersville, the same town where Don's phone call originated from. Police checked into the address and found out there was a young man living there, and even though his name has never been released publicly, it was not Don or Sean. On March 15, 1990, the 1-year anniversary of the crime, 4 local radio stations agreed to simultaneously air the recording of Don's confession in hopes that someone listening might recognize his voice and come forward. Well, sure enough, 3 people soon called in, who all said they recognized Don as the aforementioned young man from Walkersville. This prompted police to question him and get a warrant to search his home. Samples of the young man's blood and hair were taken for analysis, but ultimately failed to link him to the crime, as it turned out the only blood found at the murder scene belonged to Tracey. While a search of this man's residence turned up a lot of newspaper clippings and material to suggest he had an obsession with the case, there was no direct evidence to implicate him in the crime, and no indication that he even knew Tracey personally. He decided to plead the Fifth Amendment and refused to answer any questions. It's not entirely clear how or when they came to this conclusion, but police would eventually rule out the young man from Walkersville as a suspect. The case would be featured on Unsolved Mysteries in January of 1991, as well as an episode of A Current Affair, but the investigation eventually came to a standstill. A Frederick Police Department detective named Bob Servasic would take over the case, and by all accounts, it completely consumed his life until he became convinced he had figured out who the killer was. While the evidence against this suspect was circumstantial, Servasic decided to submit it to a grand jury in June of 1994. While the suspect's name was never made public, Servasic said he was in his mid to late 20s, lived in the Frederick area at the time of the murder, and was an acquaintance of Tracey through a mutual circle of friends. Servasic believed that the crime was driven by jealousy, anger, and revenge, theorizing that the killer had feelings for Tracey and could not handle it when Tracey told him she only wanted to be friends. After examining all the evidence, 2/3 of the grand jury voted to indict the suspect, but the state's attorney's office ultimately decided not to move forward with an arrest and prosecution, fearing there was still not enough evidence to bring him to trial and secure a conviction with a jury. This decision left Servasic so frustrated that it helped influence his decision to retire from the police force the following year. In 2009, the Frederick News Post published a series of articles about the 20th anniversary of Tracey's murder, and Servasic gave a very outspoken interview in which he outlined his frustrations, stating, quote, "This case was solved in 1994 as far as I was concerned. What derailed the process was politics and personal agendas. Certain individuals did not do their jobs and derailed the case." End quote. Around the same time period, the commander of the Frederick Police Department's Criminal Investigation Division stated that 2 promising suspects had developed over the years and that DNA samples had been taken from both of them, but they just lacked the final piece of the puzzle to conclusively determine if one of them committed the crime. Over the years, DNA testing was performed on evidence found at the crime scene, but the size of the samples proved insufficient enough to develop a genetic profile of the killer. While touch samples were submitted to a private contractor for the Maryland State Police in 2009, it doesn't sound like this led anywhere. So after nearly 30 years, the murder of Tracey Kirkpatrick continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to send another special thanks to Postmates, as we are thrilled that they are now supporting our podcast. Like I mentioned at the outset, your stomach and the rest of your life are often at war with each other. Human beings need to eat, but you often can't stop what you're doing to deal with the problem, and you'll often run into a situation where the only fast things available for delivery are not what you want. I mean, I host this podcast and produce weekly episodes, so of course I'm always busy, and when I need to eat, I just want to order my food as quickly and efficiently as possible and not have limited options. I really don't want to record a podcast episode about that time I ordered food, it arrived late, or not at all, and have to close off the story either by saying, the trail or food went cold. So that's why I'm happy to introduce Postmates, the app which adds a delivery option to your favorite restaurants. Just imagine anything you want to eat being delivered to you. You don't have to drive, park, or even talk on the phone to order. All you have to do is download the app and order. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, Postmates will bring you what you want within the hour. You can even see where your food is and track the driver. You forgot to get eggs and milk? No problem. Craving a tasty burger? Check. Looking for the perfect bottle of red wine or a summer beer? Order up. Postmates is your new long-term munchies booty call. I'm excited to announce that for a limited time, Postmates is giving you $100 of free delivery credit for your first 7 days. To start your free deliveries, download the Postmates app today and use the promo code COLD. Once again, the promo code is COLD, and it will get you $100 of free delivery credit for your first 7 days. So save the hassle. Get the food you love fast. Download the Postmates app and enter the promo code COLD. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the episode. Now, before we go any further, I'm going to have to address the elephant in the room with this case, and that's the identity of the person who many people seem to suspect is Tracey's killer. One key piece of information that I've withheld until this moment is the name of the shopping center security guard who discovered Tracey's body, and well, that's because his name just happens to be Don. Since he has never been publicly named as a suspect or person of interest by law enforcement, I am not going to use his last name, but if you do any research about this case online, you'll find a lot of unsubstantiated rumors that Don was Tracey's killer. I will say that at the time of the murder, Don was a deputy for the Frederick County Sheriff's Office and was moonlighting as a security guard. Don's father, who is currently deceased, was a very prominent law enforcement official in the area who served 2 terms as Frederick County Sheriff, though he was out of office by the time this crime took place. Long story short, some people suspect that because of Don's familial connections in law enforcement, a cover-up was orchestrated to protect him. His name was not mentioned at all during the Unsolved Mystery segment, as they simply presented a reenactment of a security guard discovering Tracey's body and treated him as a complete afterthought, so there's no indication that the guard was ever considered a suspect. The segment's primary focus is the confession from the caller named Don and the young man from Walkersville, but it's possible that this entire lead was nothing more than a red herring. I will say that when I first watched this segment many years ago, I always thought something seemed off about the security guard's version of events. The store where Tracey was working closed at 9 p.m., and she was last seen at 8:45, yet the guard didn't notice that the store's lights were still on and go inside until around 10:45 or so. If the guard's job was to patrol the shopping center, it struck me as a bit odd that 2 hours would pass before he noticed something was wrong, but at the time, I wondered if I was simply overthinking things. However, uncovering the rumors about this guard has caused me to look at this situation in a different light, but I'll get back to discussing this angle after I delve into the rest of the case. This is definitely one of the more heartbreaking crimes I've featured on the podcast, at least in terms of having a long-term negative impact on the victim's family, because it sounds like the trauma of Tracey's murder completely destroyed her parents. I mentioned earlier that Diane Kirkpatrick had to be treated for shock at the hospital after finding out what happened, but in addition, she had to quit her job in retail management because of the stress, and subsequently suffered from medical issues and underwent multiple back surgeries, which pretty much kept her confined to one room in her house for years. In an interview 20 years after the crime, Diane stated that she hardly went outside anymore unless one of her other kids was with her. Billy Kirkpatrick also had to quit his job as a trucker because it gave him too much time on the road to think about what happened to his daughter. The couple eventually moved into an apartment because they couldn't handle the memories of living in their old house. 2 decades after the crime, Billy and Diane said they were both still on medication to help them deal with the trauma. You can also find a video on YouTube titled Who Killed Tracey Kirkpatrick, which was produced in 2016 and features an interview with Billy and one of Tracey's sisters, Deonda. It's obvious that they are still in great pain from losing Tracey, and Deonda breaks down in tears several times. The Unsolved Mystery segment put a lot of emphasis on Tracey's fascination with the Christina Rossetti poem Remember, which was inscribed on her tombstone. Ironically, the poem's central message is to not grieve someone once they are gone, and that it's better to forget them and be happy, rather than remember them and be sad. Well, Tracey's death obviously had the exact opposite effect on her family, since they have done nothing but grieve for her during these past 30 years. By all accounts, Tracey was a very kind, generous person with a bright future, and nobody seemed to have a bad word to say about her. This is one of those older cold cases which might have turned out differently with today's technology, as nowadays, I'm sure there would be security cameras all over the sportswear store and the shopping center to capture Tracey's killer and perhaps dissuade them from going through with the crime. It also might seem surprising that a 17-year-old girl would be closing a store by herself at night, which sounds pretty unsafe, but it was just a much different time period, and I'm sure that no one envisioned that something like this would happen. I can't help but wonder if there's some significance to the fact that Tracey was killed on the very first night she was working alone, but if she was willing to do so, that might be an indication that she never suspected her life was in danger and was taken by complete surprise when the perpetrator attacked her. Right from the outset, investigators believe Tracey knew her killer, as the lack of sexual assault or robbery suggests this crime was not a random attack and was very personal in nature. So now let's talk about the confession from the man calling himself Don. The Unsolved Mysteries website and a new text update on the Amazon Prime version of the episode state that this guy has been cleared as a suspect, but there's still a lot of confusion here. As you recall, police were contacted by Martha Woodworth, who claimed she had been corresponding with a guy named Sean, and after hearing the recording of Don's confession, Woodworth became convinced that it was Sean's voice. Now, we do know that police tracked this guy down and found out his name was not Don or Sean, and a search of his residence proved he had an obsession with Tracey Kirkpatrick's murder, but there was no evidence that he was actually involved. At the time, they took blood and hair samples from him, but I see no indication that they took his DNA, as this was back in 1990, when DNA testing was still in its infancy. So I have to wonder if they tested his DNA at a later time, which is when he was officially cleared as a suspect. I'm getting the impression that this young man may have simply been a mentally unbalanced person who developed an unhealthy fixation with Tracey's case and desperately wanted to solve it, even though he had no personal connection with her. Now, what we know for certain is that this man did correspond with Martha Woodward using the name Sean, since the return address on the envelope he sent her was traced back to his residence in Walkersville. But what's not so clear is whether or not they conclusively established if he called the confession hotline. Remember, this guy pleaded the fifth and refused to answer any questions, but I'm guessing he never admitted to making the call. I think there's a good chance he did, because not only did Martha Woodworth recognize his voice, but after the recording of the confession was broadcast on the radio, no fewer than 3 people came forward to identify him. But here's where the complication comes in. If you visit the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, which I'm always referencing on this podcast, you'll find an extensive thread there dating back to 2005. It was started by a poster with the username DinoGuy88, who corresponded many years ago with a person claiming to be Dawn, the security guard's daughter. This person eventually ceased all contact, so take everything I say here with a huge grain of salt, as we have no idea if she actually was Dawn's daughter or if any of the information she shared was true. But she claimed that she recognized the voice on the confession tape as her father. So if the young man from Walkersville did not actually make that phone call, could this mean the confession was actually genuine? Well, it's worth noting that even though the police seemed to think the confession sounded convincing, it does not sound like the caller provided any specific details about the crime, which were not already public knowledge at that time. And even though this tidbit has never been publicly confirmed, Martha Woodworth herself once made a post on the Unsolved Mysteries message board in 2009 claiming that information about the confession hotline in Las Vegas was found inside the residence of the young man from Walkersville. So I think the most logical explanation is that the phone call was made by this guy, but it was nothing more than a hoax, and he had no direct knowledge about the murder. However, here's the thing I have trouble with. The caller specifically said his name was Don, and we know that was not the real name of the guy from Walkersville. So if he made the call, why did he choose that particular name? It seems like quite a coincidence that the person whom some people believe is the real killer would also be named Don. Some of the original newspaper articles about the case did print the name of the security guard who found Tracey's body, but they didn't give off any impression that he might have been involved. If Don the security guard wasn't the person who called the confession hotline, part of me wonders if it was someone who suspected Don might be the killer, but were too scared to come forward, so they decided to make a false confession in which they called themselves Don in hopes of pointing the investigation in his direction. Of course, I have no idea if the man from Walkersville would have known Don, but here's another interesting piece of information shared by the person claiming to be Don's daughter. And again, take this with a huge grain of salt. Apparently, around the time of the murder, Don lived in Walkersville and had a roommate named Sean. I have no idea if there's any truth to that at all, but if there is, it's quite interesting that another guy living in Walkersville would decide to start poking around into the case using the false names Don and Sean. He may have uncovered something which made him believe they were connected to the murder somehow, and for whatever reason, he just decided to convey this information in the most bizarre fashion imaginable. Whatever the case, it sounds like it's been conclusively established that the person who received the most attention in the Unsolved Mystery segment was not the killer. As of 2009, investigators seemed to believe that 2 other people were viable suspects, but retired detective Bob Servasic said there was only 1 suspect and that they should have been arrested a long time ago. As you recall, Servasic took evidence against this suspect to a grand jury in 1994, and while 2/3 of them voted for an indictment, the state's attorney's office felt the evidence was not sufficient enough to take the case to trial and secure a conviction. While specific details about these grand jury proceedings have never been made public, so without knowing anything about the evidence against this suspect, I cannot comment on whether the decision not to make an arrest was the correct one. When you're a prosecutor, there's always the fear that if the evidence isn't strong enough to convince a jury and they vote for an acquittal, you will not get another shot to try the defendant for the same crime again. So I can definitely understand their hesitation about going to trial, even if they strongly believed they got the right person. But Servasic was very outspoken about his belief that they made the wrong decision, and given some of the rumors that are floating out there about this case, some of his comments are pretty interesting in hindsight. Servasic said that the whole thing was derailed by, quote-unquote, politics and personal agendas, and that, quote-unquote, certain people did not do their jobs. Well, we don't know the identity of the suspect he wanted to indict, but let's just assume it was Don the security guard. His father was a former Frederick County sheriff, and from what I've read about him online, he seemed to be a very well-respected figure in law enforcement. At the time of Tracey's murder, it sounds like Don was attempting to follow in his father's footsteps, since he was a deputy with the same sheriff's office. While Servasic did not want to elaborate on those comments he made about politics and personal agendas, it's really easy to read between the lines and figure out what he was trying to imply there. Servasic also said that the suspect was an acquaintance of Tracey's, and while it's never been publicly established that Tracey and Don knew each other, it's reasonable to assume they would have crossed paths, since Don was a security guard at the shopping center. Servasic's theory seems to be that the killer had feelings for Tracey, but when she told him she only wanted to be friends, that set him off. And here's another interesting side story. Tracey had also been working a shift at the clothing store on the night before her murder, but was late arriving home after the store closed. Her father decided to drive to the shopping center to check on her, and found Tracey talking to a former boyfriend of hers. While they had previously broken up, they had now made the decision to get back together. But then the very next night, Tracey wound up dead. If Servasic's theory is correct, I can totally see how the murder might have played out. Tracey was killed right before the store closed, and if the killer knew she was working alone that night, he might have felt it was the ideal time to stop by and express his feelings for her. And really, who would have a better idea about Tracey being alone than the security guard? But if Tracey told this person that she was now back together with her boyfriend again, this could have been the breaking point which caused him to turn violent. While I'm skeptical that the person who called the confession hotline was Tracey's killer, I will say that his description of the murder would fit this scenario. Remember, he said, quote, "One night when she was in the storeroom and we were talking, our conversation turned into an argument, and so I took a knife that I have with me at all times, and I killed her," end quote. If this was a spur-of-the-moment rage killing, it would explain why there was no sexual assault and nothing was stolen from the store. It is interesting that Tracey's purse, car keys, and store keys were missing, and I'm not sure if they were ever recovered. But if the killer was obsessed with Tracey, they might have decided to keep her purse as a memento. One thing about this case which has always struck people as odd is that Tracey was stabbed 7 times, which you'd assume would cause the killer to get a lot of blood on them, but nobody reported seeing anything. We do have one witness who was in the shopping center parking lot around this time period, and he didn't see or hear anything, but since blood drops were found in a rear hallway which led to the loading dock, the killer probably escaped that way. And once again, a security guard would probably know the best place to slip out of the shopping center undetected. People who believe Don was the killer think this might account for the time discrepancy before he reported Tracey's murder to the police. Like I mentioned earlier, when I first watched the Unsolved Mystery segment, I didn't know anything about Don the security guard being a potential suspect, so I found it odd that nearly 2 full hours passed after closing time before he noticed that the lights were still on inside the store, and he went in there to discover Tracey's body. I have no idea what Don's schedule was for making his rounds, but that seems like an awful lot of time for him to not notice that something was amiss. But if Don was guilty, this 2-hour window would have given him plenty of time to dispose of the murder weapon, clean up all the evidence which implicated him, and go change into a different uniform if he got any blood on himself. Once he's covered the whole thing up, Don then returns to the murder scene to quote-unquote discover Tracey's body, hoping that this will make himself look less suspicious. There's also the fact that Tracey was murdered inside the rear storage room. Judging from the physical evidence at the scene, it does not seem like Tracey was attacked inside the actual store, so she was either forcibly dragged into the storage room or she went in there voluntarily with her killer. From my experience working in retail, I can tell you that it was usually a major no-no for employees to allow outsiders into the back rooms, even if they were close friends or family members. But if it was a security guard, Tracey might have thought it was okay to take him back there. Even if Don had stopped by the store and made advances towards Tracey on previous occasions, it may not have raised any red flags with her, since it was his job to patrol the area, and he also happened to be a deputy sheriff. Even if she took Don into the storage room in order to privately rebuff his advances, she probably didn't expect him to turn violent. Now, since Don has never been publicly named as a suspect, I'm going to stop short with conclusively naming him as the killer. But man, Tracey being murdered by the same security guard who found her body is a scenario which makes a lot of sense. The main reason I doubt that Don the security guard was the one who called the confession hotline is because Don was a deputy sheriff and his father was a prominent law enforcement official, so I think someone from the Frederick Police Department would have recognized Don's voice if it was him. Yes, if you believe the theory that there was a cover-up, you could assume that perhaps the police only pretended not to recognize Don's voice, but remember, they asked a bunch of local radio stations to play the full recording of the confession, which I don't think they would do if they were trying to protect the person on the tape. The listeners who called in to say they recognized the caller's voice all pointed to the young man from Walkersville, but as far as I can tell, none of them pointed to Don. In addition, if Don was the suspect that the grand jury voted to indict in 1994, I think having a recording of his voice confessing to the murder would have been strong enough evidence to bring the case to trial. So I lean towards the caller not being the actual killer, but did he have ulterior motives for saying his name was Don? It's hard to say, as without knowing more specific details about the guy from Walkersville, I'm not sure if he would have had any inside knowledge of the crime. It's also worth noting that while Don and his father worked for the Frederick County Sheriff's Office, the actual investigation into Tracey's murder was performed by the Frederick Police Department, which is a municipal agency, though I'm sure the Sheriff's Office would have a lot of influence over them. If the Frederick PD were involved in a cover-up and trying to protect Don, I do wonder why they would have allowed the case to be broadcast on Unsolved Mysteries to begin with. But then again, if they knew for certain that the caller to the confession hotline wasn't Don, they might have been more than happy to allow a false lead like that to garner attention on national television and take all the focus away from the real killer. Whatever the truth, it does sound like quite a few people believe that people in power have played a role in allowing the perpetrator to get away with it for nearly 30 years. I know that in the articles published about this case in 2009, it was mentioned that touch DNA evidence from this case was being submitted to a private contractor for the Maryland State Police, and that investigators had DNA samples from the two people they considered to be the most promising suspects. But since it doesn't sound like anything ever came of this, that suggests to me that either the DNA evidence wasn't sufficient enough to make a conclusive determination, or the DNA did not match either of the two suspects. But if there is still usable DNA, perhaps they can submit it to a genealogy website and track down the killer that way. This process has helped solve several decades-old cold cases this past year, so there's no reason it cannot happen again. It's pretty heartbreaking to watch the aforementioned YouTube interview with Tracey's sister, Deonda, who becomes very upset over the possibility that her parents might not live long enough to find out who killed Tracey and see the perpetrator brought to justice. This is one family that definitely deserves some closure after all the devastation and emotional turmoil it has brought them. So if you happen to have any information on the unsolved murder of Tracey Kirkpatrick, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've already produced some exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. Last month, we released an episode about a case which was featured as a final appeal segment on Unsolved Mysteries, the controversial conviction of Larry Race for the murder of his wife Debbie Race, and we're planning to release another exclusive bonus episode sometime this month. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon, and they are Heather H., Catherine M., LaDonna C., Inez H., and the Out of the Shadows podcast. Thank you all so much for your support. And before we bring this episode to a close, I would like to play a promo for a brand new podcast called 3 Men and a Mystery.
Welcome to 3 Men and a Mystery. I'm one of your hosts, John Lorden.
And this is Mike Morford.
And I'm Gray Hughes.
July 31st, 1999. Teenagers J.B. Hilton Green Beasley and her friend Tracey Howlett got lost on their way to a party. They wound up in Ozark, Alabama. They used another payphone to call Tracey's mother to let them know they had been lost, but were now heading home. However, they would never get home. The next morning, the car was found by local police. An investigator figures out there's a latch release for the trunk inside the car. He opens it. In the trunk were the bodies of J.B. Beasley and Tracey Howlett. They had each been shot in the head. That was almost 20 years ago.
For me personally, it's a mystery that shouldn't be a mystery. It's time for answers for the families of these two young girls.
I think it's very important to look at all cases starting with known facts and void of wild speculation. That allows people to speculate reasonably based on a foundation of accurate visual and technical information.
We've got Gray, who's a very detail-oriented technical expert when it comes to understanding maps, doing 3D recreations. We've got Morph, who is such a good people person. He's able to reach out, try to make contact. And when he does, once he gets people talking, there's some pretty amazing things that happen. So I think paralleling our 3 strong suits is going to bring something very different to this podcast than we've seen in the true crime podcast space.
With the platform that we have between us, we can raise a good level of awareness and hopefully generate tips and leads and see a resolution in this case.
Subscribe to the podcast right now so you don't miss the official premiere in May of 2019. We are 3 Men and a Mystery.
I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, and of course, the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum. I've been very careful on this episode about not treating the information posted there about Don the security guard as fact, but if you would like to learn more about this, you can find some extensive threads about the case at the forum, so be sure to check them out. Anyway, I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So we have finally hit another important milestone for this podcast, as we are officially only 1 week away from our 3-year anniversary. Can you believe it? Per tradition, I let you, the listeners, vote in a poll about which case you would like us to feature on our anniversary show, and the winner was a very prominent and highly requested case, the disappearance of the Springfield 3. So have yourself a wonderful week, and be sure to join me next Wednesday to see this case covered on our special 3-year anniversary episode of The Trail Went Cold.